talk to you all today. I'm really glad to be here. And if you have any questions as we go through, please feel free to interrupt me. Okay. Awesome, thank you. Okay, so this work is joint with Ania Jaroszewicz, Oliver Hauser, and Julian Jameson. So, okay, today I'm going to be talking about unconditional cash transfers, which are no strings attached financial payments made directly to individuals. And this is a very common poverty alleviation tool, particularly in low-income countries. And in low-income countries, we found that they generally have found to improve outcomes. So, for instance, increasing people's consumption, improving children's health, increasing asset ownership. So generally, we think that this is a good thing. More recently, they've also increasingly become a part of conversation in high-income countries. So for instance, at the start of the COVID pandemic, a lot of governments decided that they were going to start giving money to the populace. For instance, in the US, most Americans received 3 economic stimulus checks, which were intended to help people weather the storm. That said, there's really remarkably little direct evidence on the effects of UCTs in high-income countries. And among the studies that do exist, they tend to be non-experimental, have a pretty small sample size, and/or pretty limited outcomes. Now, part of the reason for this is that it's super expensive to run high-powered RCTs in a place where money doesn't really go very far. Okay, and so we're left with some pretty basic open questions, like how do people in financial need actually use these cash transfers? For instance, how quickly do they spend them, and what are they spending them on? Second, what are the effects? How do they work? What outcomes do they shift? Through what mechanisms, and for how long? Okay, so I think there's a case to be made that cash transfers would generally be effective in high-income countries. So again, if we look at the indirect evidence from low-income countries, then we can sort of see effects are generally positive. We would think that it would translate to high-income countries. And we also know that objective and subjective wealth are not identical, but they are positively correlated. So we would think if we increase objective wealth, we should also increase subjective wealth. Okay, at the same time, I think there's also an argument to be made for why this would not be the case. So a lack of financial resources often creates a number of downstream issues. So for instance, illness, mental and physical, isolation, and so forth. And these effects might persist even if you give someone a one-time cash transfer. These are hard things to fix, right? And there's also some work showing that opportunities for upward mobility, like receiving large piles of cash, and various other sorts of interventions can actually produce psychological and emotional challenges. So for instance, you receive some money, maybe you're confused about what your identity is, which group you belong to, perhaps you feel guilty about the fact that you received opportunities that others did not, which I think would sort of suggest that maybe UCTs are not going to be so effective. And there is, of course, always the middle option, which is maybe they sort of work. So maybe they address simple issues like you can buy your groceries, but maybe they don't address these more complex, deeper issues like depression. Or maybe they work for some temporal thing. Maybe they work in the short term, but not the long term, or vice versa. Okay. Third and finally is for whatever the effects actually are, we would also like to know how they vary by the size of the UCT. Okay, why do we care about this? Well, it can help us understand, for instance, are we better off giving a smaller amount of money to 4 different people or a larger amount of money, 4 times that amount, to 1 person? In the case of the US economic stimulus checks, politicians were seriously debating amounts ranging from $600 to $2,000, with a whole lot of debate among politicians, Donald Trump and Joe Biden, for instance, as well as lay people and economists, about what amount was actually going to be sufficient and actually help people. Okay, so in this study, we're going to try to answer some of these questions, and I'm going to tell you about 2 different studies here. First, sort of creatively called to the main study, we randomize low-income households in the US to one of 3 groups. We're either giving them nothing, $500 or $2,000 as a one-time UCT. And then we're looking at the outcomes: financial, psychological, cognitive capacity, and physical health over time from 1 week to 3 months out. In addition, we also run a prediction study with experts and lay people, asking them to predict the results of the main study. So just to give you a preview of what we find that both of the $500 and $2,000 UCTs do increase spending, sort of suggesting that they're improving some objective financial outcomes. And this lasts for a couple weeks. But in contrast to everybody's expectations, including my own, we find that the money does not really seem to have any positive effects on our pre-specified survey outcomes. And in fact, if anything, it looks like there are negative effects. And we also find that there are no differences between the two cash amounts. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, great. All right, so I'm gonna jump into the methods. If you want to see all the materials and stuff, you can find them there. Okay, so this is a timeline of the study. And so the whole study was run in partnership with a nonprofit organization that specializes in providing cash transfers, and they operate only in the US. Enrollment occurred between July 2020 and January 2021. So this is really like thick of the pandemic before vaccines came out. Everyone was recruited by the nonprofit organization, and in the recruitment materials, we did not mention UCTs. We only mentioned the survey payments, which were up to $100. That said, because this is a nonprofit that specializes in giving cash transfers, we might expect that some people expected that they might receive some additional money. In fact, we have survey evidence suggesting that that is the case for a fraction of people. So just something to keep in mind. All right, so yes.
Can you say how that fits in with the cash transfers which the federal government was making anyway?
Yes.
What's the timing of all that?
So it depends a bit. So we had 7 different waves of participants starting at different times throughout this period. And some of them do have overlap. So the economic stimulus checks came over the course of maybe 6 months or so. So there is some overlap. Like the folks who were recruited in January 2021, they received the largest economic stimulus check of $1,400 in February, which is just a month after. And we have data, both administrative and survey, being able to track who is receiving these. So, okay, after enrollment, everyone takes a baseline survey. This is before there's any intervention, and only the folks who respond to this are subsequently randomized. Okay, randomization. People are put into one of 3 groups. The control group does not receive anything beyond the survey completion payments. The $500 group gets $500. This is half a month of total household income. And by total household income here, I mean earned plus unearned. So this is money from wages, but also things like welfare and alimony and so forth. This is everything that they're receiving. And then the $2,000 group is getting $2,000 US or about 2 months of total household income. In addition, at the nonprofit's request, so they also asked us to cross-randomize with something else. So at the time that we were launching this, they had just revealed something new on like an online platform that they had, and they were interested in testing it. And so they asked us to cross-randomize with access to this. It has nothing to do with money. And so we pre-registered that we were going to do that, but we weren't going to be analyzing it. And we would just control for it in regressions. In fact, it turned out to have absolutely no effect on anything, but I'm just flagging it so that when it comes up in the regressions, you're not surprised. All right, so what happens after people receive this money or not? They receive 3 post-treatment surveys. So the first one comes 1 week after cash payment. The next one comes a month and a week later, and the last one comes 3 months and 1 week later. This timing may sound a little bit funny. The reason for it is because we wanted to make sure that people were taking the survey at the same time of month each time. So when you are a low-income person, your finances might look very different depending on whether we're asking, for instance, at the start of the month or at the end, based on when your rent is due or when you're receiving your paycheck and so forth. So we wanted to make sure that we could control for that and decrease noise. Okay, so what was in those surveys? There were 4 main sections. The first section was on financial well-being. So for instance, subjective financial well-being, like I feel secure about my financial future. Also other things like credit constraints, how able are you to get a certain amount of money, $400 over the next few days, savings, employment, and so forth. The psychological well-being section asked about positive mental health. So over the past week, I've often been carefree and in good spirits. Also some more negative mental health things like anxiety, loneliness, depression as the PHQ-9, minus the suicide measure. Cognitive capacity. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the scarcity literature, but there is a theory that when you are lacking in some sort of resource, in this case, financial resources, your mind is preoccupied with that resource. And you then have less cognitive bandwidth to focus on other things, or for instance, solve puzzles or do mentally challenging activities. And so this section was intended to test some of those theories. And so, for instance, we have grievance matrices, measure of fluid intelligence, in which you are trying to identify what the pattern is across different shapes, and then identify which tile is supposed to fit into the missing piece. And then finally, we had physical health. So asked things about like sleep quality, food security, nutrition. For instance, in the past week, how many days did you eat 5 or more servings of fruits and vegetables? Okay, obviously this is a ton of variables. And so what we do is we create an index for each of those 4 outcome categories I just showed you. And these serve as our 4 main survey DVs. And then we do multiple hypothesis testing corrections. Our primary analysis is an intent to treat. So regardless of who ultimately received or used the money or knew about it, we're going to treat them as treated if they were randomized as such. And all of this is pre-registered. Okay, for those interested in econometric specifications, we're looking at an ANCOVA in which we're conditioning on baseline levels to increase power. So what we're trying to do is look at one of those 4 indices, financial, psychological, cognitive capacity, or health, for a given person at post-treatment time periods. We're primarily interested in the treatment group indicators. So if you were in the $500 group or $2,000 group, as I said, controlling for access to the online platform features, and then conditioning on the baseline index value. Okay, so in addition to those survey outcomes, yeah.
I'm just wondering, are they in the treatment control groups? Are they in different, how segregated are they? Are they in different parts of the city, in different places?
Yes, they are all over. I'll show you a map a little bit later, but I think we have 45 states of the 50. So yeah, they're all over the country. And as far as we can tell, they don't really have any sense of who else is in the study. Yeah, good question. Yes.
Have you tested on the different outcome variables relative, for example, your physical health, your mental health, also when control from baseline index values? Do you control for everything? It's just them, but the one only different.
Yeah, so I will show you a regression table later, but yeah, so for each time we have a dependent measure, we're only controlling for the dependent for that same index. We're not controlling for all of the other ones at that time. Yeah, Katya.
And your survey time period, is it the first, the last, or the first, the middle, the last? So you have 3 surveys, right? Mm-hmm. So are they all analyzed simultaneously, or you're interested in a change?
We're interested in both. So the primary specification is collapsing across them, but then we also look at the time trends.
Okay.
Yeah. Good clarification. Okay, so all right, in addition to the survey data, we also have some data from the nonprofit organization that we partner with. So for the entire sample, we can see all of the payments that people are receiving, both the UCT payments and the survey payments. And then in addition, we also have data on what people intended on using the money for. So at the time that they received the money, whenever they wanted to be pulling it out, and I can talk more about sort of what exactly that process looked like if anyone is interested. But folks were asked, what do you intend on using this money for? Totally optional, totally non-binding. And so 64% of the sample responded to those questions. All right, and then in addition, for 43% of our sample, the 43% that opted into this, we have bank data. So folks were able, for a small payment, to link one of their bank accounts, one or more of their bank accounts, and then we can see that, right? So these are primarily checking accounts that people are linking. And for those accounts, we can see account balances. So we can see how much money they have in their account every day over the time period that we have the data for. And then we can also see transactions. So we can see how much money people are spending, when they're spending it, and what they're spending it on. Okay, this sample is self-selected, right? 43% is less than 100. And you might be concerned that these are not representative. They are, in fact, a little bit different. They do tend to be poorer than the rest of the population, the rest of the sample. They don't look any different on the other measures. And it turns out that when we restrict analyses to just this group, the results are very similar, which is, I think, a necessary, albeit not sufficient condition for indicating that it's not a super strange sample. Okay, so what do these folks look like? So we have about 5,200 participants. And at baseline, so this is a pretty poor population. So total median household income, so again, this is both earned and unearned income together, it's about $1,000 a month for a median family of 4. The overwhelming majority have less than $100 in savings. They have way more debt than savings, and around 2/3 of them are unemployed, with about half of that group having just lost their jobs during COVID. So this is a pretty poor sample. And incidentally, we also asked about their financial profile pre-COVID, and many of them were also sort of struggling financially even earlier. And so it's not just being driven by the COVID shocks. So, okay, to Chris's question, so where are these folks coming from? So everyone is in the mainland US and pretty geographically dispersed. And kind of our modal participant, if you will, is a woman who identifies as Black or African American, who has children and does not have a partner or spouse. Average age is around mid-30s. And then we have balance across treatment groups on all the main demographics and other financial variables that you might care about. Okay, responsiveness. So yes, Michelle, is that right? Yeah. Okay, great.
Did you control for financial literacy?
We do not. So we actually did not measure financial literacy at all. We have education data. So okay, there we go.
It's very sensitive.
All right, so yeah, looks like about 60% have completed high school or higher. But yeah, that's, and we do control for this in some of our regressions where we're looking at all of these covariates, but we don't have financial literacy per se. Yes, or not a question. Okay, sorry. All right. So, okay. Yeah, okay, so responsiveness. So we have 16,000-ish survey responses. So responsiveness is pretty good for a low-income population in the US. But we did lose some people along the way. This is not predicted by indices at baseline, but it is predicted by treatment group, with the cash groups being more responsive than control. And this is something that I'll come back to at the end. Okay, so what do we find? All right, so the first thing we wanted to do is just check to make sure that people actually got the money they were supposed to get. So this is plotting both UCT and survey payments over the course of the entire trial. This is administrative data from the nonprofit. And so reassuringly, what we see is that the control group is getting just over 0, 500 is just getting just over 500, 2,000, just over 2,000. So that's exactly what we would hope for. Okay, the next question though, which I think is a bit more interesting, is can we see this data for the folks who gave us access to their bank accounts? And so for the subset, what we can do is we can plot days relative to the UCT payment on the X, and then current balance in their bank accounts on the Y. And as you can see, before the UCT comes in, there are no differences between the treatment groups. As soon as the UCT comes in, we sort of see an immediate boost, small one for the $500 group, and then a much larger one for the $2,000 group. Okay, and then I think what's interesting is you can also see how quickly it goes away. So just in a matter of a few weeks, these gaps are really fully closing. Okay, you might be curious why this gap is smaller than 500 and the other one is smaller than 2,000. The reason for this is because the bank accounts that people give us access to are not necessarily the same ones that they actually put the money into. So we're basically just averaging in a bunch of zeros here. Okay, so where is this money going, right? One possibility is that people are taking this money and putting it basically into a different savings account that we don't have access to. Another one is that they're spending it, okay? And so for this, we can turn to the transactions data. So here, what I'm plotting again on the x-axis here is days relative to the UCT, and on the y now is spending relative to control. Yeah.
Can we keep it as cash?
Yes, that actually turns out to be an important piece of this. Yeah. So if value is above zero, I mean that the cash groups are spending more than control. Okay.
And we have a question from online,
yeah.
whenever you want to
Please.
Hi, can anyone hear me?
Yes,
we can.
Fantastic. The last slide, I was just musing about that. What's with this trend, the upward trend in the control group? That's really the explanation of why the gap is closing. What am I missing here?
Yeah, so the general upward trend and then the sort of decrease, where that's coming from is that a large chunk of our participants, 80% of them, were recruited within a 6-week period. And so this is tracking very closely to the sort of general trend we see in the US about how low income folks were doing over time. So this is basically being driven by people receiving economic stimulus checks, as well as unemployment insurance, child tax credits. And then basically those benefits are running out for people.
I see.
Yeah.
Could you plot this graph for the year before? Would you have that information?
We do for a very small subset. So the way that the bank access data works, it varies by financial institution, and each financial institution has a different set of rules for like when someone opts into this, what they're allowed to give. And so for some people, we only have it for like 3 months or 6 months. For some people, we have it going back as far as several years. But the folks for whom we have it for several years is a much smaller sample. So we could do it for those folks. I'm not sure how informative it would be.
No, but you're not worried about this general upwards trend. You can explain that away.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree though. It would be nice to sort of see how it was in the previous year, just as a point of comparison.
Can I add to this?
Yeah, please.
Because the stimulus should affect everybody equally, right?
Yeah.
So maybe it's not so much of a concern, but do you lose sort of like eligibility for stimulus once you are treated by 2,000 dollars?
No, so the cool thing about the stimulus checks is that they went to literally everybody. So whether you were a millionaire or so that's not an issue. Some of the other ones like child tax credit, and some of there are various others that are sort of more specific to lower income groups. But in most cases, people can't lose eligibility for these anyway, because these can be treated as effectively gifts. And so for tax purposes and legal purposes, it doesn't end up affecting your eligibility. Yeah.
Sorry, I just have one more question. So,
Please.
is it just happenstance that like your control group before the UCT date, they seem to be generally at the bottom there? As it is that just happenstance that they will end up being at the bottom like by randomization, or is there?
These differences are not significant. But yeah. Yes. Okay, so spending, here we are. So what do we find? So before the UCT comes in, there are no differences between either cash group and control. As soon as the UCT comes in, you see this immediate boost for the $500 group, and then you see this much larger boost in spending for the $2,000 group. And so if we're just looking at the first 2 weeks, these folks are spending about $26 more a day and $82 more per day, which means that they effectively are using around 60% and 75% of their entire check just in those first 2 weeks. Yes.
Are you able to like compare these results to what the similarly sized transfers in low income countries, like how they affected spending, just to see whether, because you're saying we're doing this in the US, this is a new context, just to see like, is this bigger or smaller? Like, let's say adjusting for purchasing power, adjusting for, let's say, whatever the times median income is or whatever.
Yes. So there are a few ways that we can benchmark. So for instance, the marginal propensity to consume in these contexts is very similar, meaning like the fraction of the money that they're using is very similar to what you see in low income countries, which is to say it's very high. People who are living hand to mouth sort of using it all immediately. And we can also see some similarities also in terms of what people are spending it on. It really sort of ends up being, I'll get to this in a moment, but it's sort of like immediate needs, primarily food, bills and so forth.
Is there any differences, main differences?
Like across countries or, that's simple. I mean, I probably should have come up with a more systematic way of testing that.
Yeah.
But I mean, in general, like in terms of ballpark, it seems to be fairly similar. There are some cross-cultural differences where you tend to see, for instance, in some places, people might be more likely to spend it on alcohol or spend it on education expenses for their children. Whereas
I think it would just be interesting, given that you're saying that like we're doing this in a new context.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. It has this interesting thing, whatever.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's the same, and that's also interesting.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, my sense is that typically it's more the same than different.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good question. So, all right. So people are spending the money. What are they spending it on? So these are the intended money usage answers. So these are open text responses, which have been coded up for a number of different categories. And here I'm just plotting the percent of each of the 3 treatment groups that name one of these spending categories for what they're planning on using the money for, both UCT and survey payments. And so you can sort of see that the largest gap here is coming in the category called bills, a sort of general category for people spending money on that, as well as in housing. So that seems to be primarily where the unconditional cash transfers are going. One cool thing about this is that it covers most of our sample, and it sort of provides a window into what people want to be using the money for, potentially. But you could also be concerned that, you know, maybe people intend on using it for one thing, they use it for something else, and or maybe they're trying to sound better, like they're planning on using it for something that they think is not going to be acceptable, and so they change their responses for the experimenter. So we can also look at bank data. So here what I'm doing is I'm plotting how much more in dollars the cash group is spending relative to control on average every day over the course of the trial. These are categories given to us by the financial institution, so those are preset categories. And you can see that the largest increase is coming in this broad category called transfers. So going to your question, Chris, on cash. A lot of this is being driven by ATM withdrawals, as well as loading prepaid debit cards and Venmo and Zelle. So, which unfortunately means that we sort of lose a lot of the specificity on like what exactly is happening to this money after they've taken it out. But we do also see an increase in shocks. So this is like Dollar Tree, Amazon, Target. Services primarily being cell phone bills, food and drink mostly being groceries rather than eating out. A little bit on travel. This is primarily gas, parking fees. And then interestingly, no decrease in bank fees, even when we restrict to what we call bad bank fees, which is like late payments, late payment fees, overdraft charges, cash advances, and so forth. Yes.
Bills on it.
So bills, no. So bills would also fall under transfers in most cases. Yeah. Yeah.
This is the same sample as the sample from the graph before. Is this sort of like a lower one? No?
Yes. Yeah. So this is all else equal going to be lower on worse financial state. Yeah. Yes.
Just to quickly ask, you don't find any differences by gender?
No, although I think we have something like 86% women, so it's sort of imbalanced. Yeah. All right, so the first takeaway then, both the $500 and $2,000 UCTs increasing spending for a few weeks. Okay, so how does this square up with our survey outcomes? So on the x-axis here, the 4 surveys now relabeled as T1 to T4, T1 again being the baseline survey before there's any intervention. On the y-axis is index value. Higher values are going to be better here, and the control group by construction is always going to be perfectly flat at 0. Okay, so this is the financial index. And so the first thing you'll notice here is that both the $500 and $2,000 groups are really trending very closely together, which I think is already kind of surprising. And then the second thing is that they both seem to be doing at least weekly worse than control, which is certainly not what we expected. Okay. And we're seeing a very similar pattern for the psychological index, the cognitive capacity index, as well as the physical health index. So if we throw this into a regression, so these 4 columns are for the 4 indices. We're primarily interested in these top 2 rows. And you can see that the effects are negative across the board, statistically significant for financial, psychological, and physical health, and marginally significant for cognitive capacity.
Could there be any sort of differential attrition between control and treatment?
That is, in fact, one of the explanations we test. The short answer is almost certainly not. We cannot 100% rule it out, but it seems extremely unlikely.
In the previous graphs, whether they come in, so these are the estimates of dummies, these are coefficient estimates, right?
Yeah.
And they're coming from several regressions, so from.
No, this is one regression.
No, the graphs, so these.
This is just plotting raw data.
Oh, and then why the control group is flat?
Oh, because of the way that we construct these indices, they're all pegged to the control group at each time point. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So, okay, the lack of positive results is robust to basically anything you can think of, constructing the indices in different ways. If you want to include a whole bunch of different covariates or not. If you split out by time period, if you only look at participants who correctly reported how much cash they had received, perhaps an indicator both of how cognizant they were of this, but also how careful they are being with the survey. Okay, so second takeaway, we're not seeing any positive effects of cash on any of our pre-specified survey outcomes. No differences between the 2 cash amounts. And then I don't really have time to get into this, but maybe we can come back to it in the questions if anyone's interested. So suggestively, we're also not seeing any differences if we look for less than 1 week after cash. We're not really seeing much on participant heterogeneity. There are a few very suggestive results, but frankly, they are not robust, so I would not put any stock into them. And then we also see that the negative effects seem to be primarily driven by more subjective rather than objective measures. So it's not that people are really actually doing worse once they receive cash, but for whatever reason, they seem to feel worse. Okay, and that's maybe something we can come back to later, given the whole well-being thing. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit now and talk about the prediction study. So perhaps you're thinking like, okay, well, this is all obvious. We're not surprised by this. We're talking about hindsight bias earlier today. So what did we do in the prediction study? We had 2 samples. We had one we're calling experts, social scientists, and policymakers. So these folks were recruited from a range of different sources, including social science prediction platform and listservs. And then we also have a layperson sample that's representative of the US population on basic demographics. Okay, we ran this concurrently with the main study, but at the very, very start. So we launched this when we had 1% of the post-treatment surveys in. And what we did is we gave everyone an overview of the main survey. We gave them a quick tutorial on what standard deviations are with a few practice problems. And then we asked them to predict the effects of each cash amount on each index at each time period. And then we incentivized them for accuracy. Okay, so what do we find? So here I'm breaking this out by the 4 indices with, now the x-axis is just the 3 post-treatment time periods, since that's all we asked about. Okay, and so first, these are the actual results from the main trial. So we've already seen these with the both cash groups having slightly negative effects. Okay, and now here are the predictions. So solid being the $2,000 group, 500 being dashed. And as you can see, all of the values are positive. So everyone generally thinks positive effects of cash on all the indices at all the time points. It also thinks that more money is going to be better than less money. Not surprising. But then what I think is striking about this is just how large this overestimation is. So depending on the index, the time period, and the treatment group, we're looking at overestimations between 0.2 and 0.7 standard deviations. So that's pretty sizable. You might be thinking experts are going to be less optimistic. You would be partially right. So they are, in fact, on average, less optimistic or perhaps better calibrated on standard deviations, depending on how you want to interpret this. But I think you can still see that there is an overestimation across the board. One potential concern with this is people are just like, what the heck are indices and how do I think about these? And so to address this, what we did is we also pulled one representative question from each of the 4 indices and then just asked specifically about that. So for instance, for the financial index, it's like, to what extent are you able to meet your and your household's financial needs this month, right? That's much easier to think about, I think, than a financial index. And so we find that the results are basically identical. People are still pretty dramatically overestimating the effectiveness of cash, even on these more individual concrete questions, which I think suggests that this is not just being driven by people misunderstanding what the indices are. Okay, so third takeaway, both experts and lay people overestimated the effectiveness of cash. Yes, Marta.
I love that you did this. I didn't realize that you did this at the very outset, so I was just curious, like, why you did that. Were you interested in like the diminishing returns that people would predict from this, or?
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is sort of touching onto a much larger issue or phenomenon, right? Where in many situations you have policymakers making decisions based on not totally sure what. So like those headlines that I showed you at the beginning, where people were like, $600 is not enough, $2,000 will fix everything. Those sorts of things. People have a lot of strong opinions based on, it's unclear what. So the point of the prediction study was to sort of capture that and sort of see exactly if we can make it a bit more scientific. Yeah. Yes.
I don't know if I missed this, but did the experts in the study know about the profile of the sample?
Yes.
So they were aware of like the breakdown of the.
Yes. Yeah. So we gave them, the sort of basic information for everyone who we had recruited at that point and sort of what they looked like. And yeah. Yes.
Were the estimates of the experts kind of similar, or there's a huge variation in the?
Oh, so there was actually remarkably small standard. There are 95% confidence intervals around these.
So they are paying, I was wondering whether there no standard deviation on that estimates. There are.
They're just very, very small. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. But I'm wondering if there's a better way to illustrate that. But yeah. Okay, so, all right, so what the heck happened? This is not what we were expecting. It's not what the predictors were expecting. So in the paper, we test and go through a large number of explanations. We largely rule them out. And I'm happy to go into detail on any of these if we have time. Maybe we can come back to it at the end. But right, so it doesn't seem that people are sort of strategically, trying to sound needy so that they get more money. It doesn't seem like they're spending money in ways that hurt them, in ways that sort of decrease their overall well-being. It doesn't seem that people are expecting that they might be getting more money in the future and therefore feeling sad about where they are now. It does not seem to be driven by differential attrition, most likely. It's not the case that probably that people, received money from a nonprofit organization, charity, effectively, and sort of feeling poor because they received it. Nor does it seem to be driven by the fact that people are comparing their life to a time in which they had money and then sort of feeling sad about the fact that now they're below a reference point. What doesn't seem to be, yes.
How do you rule out the charity business?
Yeah, so This is, so we asked people, oh, I can show you. Mouse.
It is very tricky to find them out. I don't know, the same on this computer. It's
Is it really?
surprisingly complicated, yeah, to find the bugs.
So this is what we show for when people receive the notification that they've been randomly chosen to get the money. This is the notice that they receive. So it's for people who are struggling financially, which I think is consistent with people potentially thinking this is a charity. Maybe I'm going to feel worse about it. We do also say, however, it's due to the coronavirus pandemic, which other work has shown has like dramatically shifted how people think about liability for being needy, financially needy. And we also importantly say that they've been randomly selected, okay? And so later on, we ask folks explicitly, why do you think that, some people got something in the study and others didn't, or why people received effectively different treatments? And we find that the cash groups are no more likely to say that they received it because they were poor or any sort of other financial characteristics. And they are more likely to say that they received it because they were randomly chosen to get it. And so we think that this is inconsistent with the belief that they think that they received it because they're extra poor.
No, but receiving it is still different from how you feel when you get given it. Is not the same as answering that question.
That's a fair point. Yeah. And so it's possible that there's some sort of, cognitive, like rationally, I can realize something, but maybe I still feel a different way. Yeah, I think that's a fair critique. Yeah. Okay. So, all right. The final explanation that we test here relates to saliency of needs. And so if getting cash makes people think about all of the ways in which they could spend that cash, meaning sort of makes their needs salient to them, and they think that those needs exceed their resources, even their now increased resources, this could be distressing. And so indeed, we find some evidence consistent with this. So relative to the control group, the cash groups thought about money more in hypothetical vignettes. They felt more stressed by the decision of how to spend their money. They felt more overwhelmed and burdened by the needs of people living outside their household, family and friends. And then when we asked them about how they would spend a hypothetical $500 stimulus check, they named more spending categories, which we think is consistent with this idea that the more needs were salient to them. Okay, and so then depending on the analyses, these variables either partially or fully mitigate the effect of cash on the different index values. Okay, so this isn't ironclad. The study was not designed to test why money makes people sad, but this is the best evidence we have. All right, so we think that cash may have made people's needs and the gap between their resources and their needs more salient. All right, so just a few caveats. COVID was tough. This was a really challenging time. This is a participant group that was particularly affected by those challenges. So you have to be careful in thinking about how much does this generalize. But I think the results do at least suggest that cash may be a mixed blessing. So on the one hand, it can help alleviate economic needs. You can pay for your bills, that's positive. But on the other hand, it seems to also potentially draw attention to needs that are not alleviated, meaning that in some cases, cash may actually exacerbate a sense of financial need. Okay, and so thinking about it more broadly, how should we be balancing objective financial outcomes and subjective well-being? If all you care about is objective outcomes, then UCTs are great, right? Basically, no matter what people do, if they spend it, they save it, they pay down debt, it's going to be a positive outcome. If what you care about is subjective well-being, I think that's where it gets a little bit more complicated. This sort of suggests that one-off UCTs of this size may not be sufficient, at least not in this context. Which brings up the even broader question of what should we be doing? And so one thing that we could be doing is we could be giving more money. So we know from prior literature that effective UCTs in low-income countries did tend to give more vis-a-vis purchasing power, which would suggest that maybe more money would be better. also the evidence for the mechanism that I showed you. And we also won't get into this now, but have some qualitative interviews that also sort of point to this as being a potential solution. Another potential solution is instead of giving one-off transfers, to give them on a more regular schedule. And so we know that instability in income and benefits can have a range of negative effects. Stability is good. We also know that being paid more frequently increases people's perceptions of wealth. So that is also sort of suggestive. Unfortunately, though, both of these solutions are still very expensive, right? Money is expensive, as it turns out. And so then there's a final possibility, which is taking a cash plus approach, which is combining financial resources with non-financial ones and trying to identify complementarities and ways that they can strengthen each other, which may be more cost effective. Yes.
I don't know if you have any speculation of how much would be enough in the more money category.
Yeah.
And
So
would the takeaway be basically give them 10 grand for nothing if you want to improve their subject well-being?
yeah. So there's no concrete answer. So actually, these folks, Dwyer, Stewart, and Zhao, they have a really nice chapter that calculates what the average UCT amount is for a number of cash transfer trials in different areas. And they find that in the global South, the average amount is 37% of median annual per capita income, which if you translate it to US dollars is $13,000. Obviously, you don't have to be giving $13,000, but I think we can sort of agree that probably more is going to be better. And so that's at least a sort of ballpark estimate. And actually, we now have a second study that we're currently running, in which we are randomizing folks into one of two groups, a control group, a cash only group that's getting $500 a month for 18 months. And so that'll sort of give us one data point on that. A social only group where we're sort of putting participants into groups and then decreasing barriers to help seeking and giving. And then another condition where we're combining both of them. And so hopefully we'll have a little bit more data soon on the effects of these two different approaches. That's all. Yes.
Okay. Very cool, very expensive as well. Comment about the almost last slide. There is a meta-analysis about cost effectiveness of interventions in nature human behavior, I think last year, showing that psychological therapy is an order of magnitude more effective in terms of life satisfaction. This might be a useful reference. Something that I was wondering when you presented the subjective variables is, what is the within variation of these variables? Because they seem quite stable, and aggregating into indexes make things more robust, which is great. It's much harder to measure.
Yeah.
So basically, I'm wondering, is there any chance that you can actually move within 3 weeks rather than matrices, which are like super, super stable traits, or visibility about the future? And for this, I was wondering if you have questions. How do you feel today? How do you feel yesterday? Which are typically more variable, something of this sort. I know it's for registered analysis, so you can't play too much, but just out of curiosity.
Yeah, that's great. So to the point on individual measures, yeah. So this is plotting beta coefficients, collapsing across the two cash groups, all standardized into Z-scores, so we can sort of see how they compare to control. I don't know if you have like specific interests, but here it's broken out by objective measures at the top. So things that are sort of quantifiable, accountable, can in theory be verified, and subjective measures, which is pretty much all the well-being ones at the bottom. And so I don't know if you have like specific questions about individual ones like happiness, anxiety, loneliness, friends giving you positive energy, so forth.
Just to just a quick follow-up. So here you're looking at the standard deviation within the population, so how much these are dispersed between people.
Oh, you mean for a given person, how much it changes over time?
I'm sure that the intelligence is very different, but how much is it going to change within 3 months? It's very, very hard.
Yeah, that's fair. And I'm trying to remember now exactly how we asked the questions. I think most of these were asked over the past week. Like, how happy have you felt over the past week? How anxious have you felt over the past week? And so I mean, you're the well-being expert, so yeah. So I don't know exactly how much variation is standard for seeing, and I actually can't remember off the top of my head what the numbers are, but certainly we have that data and can have an answer. Yeah. Yeah, great.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly follow up on Alberto's point about psychological therapy. So the paper that you referred to, it shows that psychological therapies helps to improve well-being of people with ill mental health, not with people who are poor. So I'm not sure that these are exactly comparable concepts. So that paper shows that if people have ill mental health, giving them therapies is better than giving them money. I'm not sure if people are poor, giving them therapies better than giving them money. Definitely that paper does not show that. This is the same paper that we're talking about. And I also was wondering, so the way you construct your index is the control group is flat and the treatment group has some dynamics. But actual indices, do they trend upward, downward? Is it that they both go up and so there is no.
It's sort of all over the map. It turns out to actually depend quite a bit on the specific question. So yeah, for some there is actually a generally improving trend, and we just see that the cash groups are improving less than the others, and for others it's sort of generally flat. There are even a few where everyone's getting worse, and the control group or the cash groups are getting even worse.
Okay, so it's not, and you, if for indices which are getting worse for the treatment group, can you ask them why they feel that way, or this is not something you can?
So like, why
so that
why do you think you're feeling fatter or
yes.
whatever? Yeah. So we do kind of try to get at this a little bit in the qualitative interviews. Honestly, the results, like that data was it was really hard to sort of get this sort of elicitation from people. It's possible that that's driven at least in part by the folks who agreed to do these interviews with us. But yeah, generally it did not yield much value. Yeah, but yeah, I do really wish that we had that. And one thing that I have been thinking about is to what extent can we sort of just outsource this and just put it like up on Prolific and be like, hey, we found these results. What do you think happened? And then see what sort of layperson, to some extent, perhaps introspection, what people come up with. Yeah.
We have a question from online. Andrew?
Yes.
Andrew?
No, got the button now. Could you put back the slide with the letter that individuals received, where they were told how much they'd won, as it were? What do you think would happen if you didn't use the expression struggling financially in that letter? I think it makes poverty very salient.
Yes.
And a subsidiary question is, what letter did you receive if you were chosen to receive nothing?
You did not receive any letter. And yeah, I do agree. I think that this does absolutely make poverty more salient. I will say one thing that I did not mention is that everybody who is in this trial had actually already applied to the nonprofit organization to receive COVID-19 relief funds.
Right.
So they, I think, have all sort of self-identified as struggling financially. And so I agree that sort of having that additional confirmation, if you will, from the nonprofit could make it extra salient, or maybe make it salient at a different time period. But I think it's not surprising to anyone in the group that they're struggling financially.
No, I'm not surprised about that either, but one group is having it emphasized to them and the other group is not.
Yeah, so yes.
They all received this.
No, they did not.
What did they get? What was the first letter they got?
The first letter, this is, yeah, so this is what the survey, so like you have a survey that's available, and then this is, you've received money for your survey. So I guess even for these, maybe this is sort of helpful. So after each survey they completed, they received this kind of email that says you're getting $20. And these ones also say you're struggling financially.
I see. Okay. Then that takes away my point. Okay, thank you.
But yes. Yeah. Do you have a?
Can we go back to where you started with the low income country experiment? And were you telling us that the results were very different from these? And so
Typically.
what's your thinking about why?
Yeah, so I think the biggest difference comes from the fact that it's just a lot more money. And I think also it's a different sort of set of issues. The sorts of people who you are comparing yourself to in lower income countries tend to also be poorer, whereas in the US, I think there tends to be a larger gap between the poor and the rich. And so there's still a further way to go if you're trying to sort of ascend the ladder.
But in the low income countries, is it continuing or is it the one-off thing?
It depends. In some cases, they're continuing, sometimes they're one-off.
But,
Yeah.
but even with the one-off, they have good results.
Sometimes, I mean, yes, I mean, I think generally, yes. And that's sort of the general consensus. But, you know, I think publication bias and so forth makes it a little bit more difficult to draw those conclusions, but I would say typically yes. So.
But they are confined again to sort of bottom 20% or something?
Not necessarily. So in many lower income countries, studies, those can be more dispersed. Like it's not, they're not just necessarily looking at the absolute poorest of the poor.
And it is a bit of a puzzle.
It is. Spent most of the last year trying to figure this out. So yes, also I do know we're at time, so I don't want to keep people. But if anyone wants to stick around, I'd be happy to talk. Yeah. Thanks. Yes, I'm going to start here.
Yeah. So I was wondering, did you is there any changes in like employment rates between the groups during the study? Because I was wondering like if the upward trend in the like control group might be maybe because they didn't get the stimulus, they went out and they looked for jobs and they got more financially long term.
Yeah.
Is there any effect of that at all?
No, sort of. We have both binary indicators of employment as well as continuous. So conditional on being employed, how much are you working?
Yeah.
So we find no change in the binary measure and a slight decrease in the number of hours worked, conditional on being employed.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Firstly, do you think that the people obviously that got it weren't as happy as the control group, and they wouldn't have known how happy the control group was? But if you told them that, do you think next time they're offered £2,000 cash transfer, they'd say no, thank you?
I do not think that. Yeah, that's actually that's something that I would love to run. Is just, I mean, and I think this is kind of an important philosophical question, right? I mean, we can show like, okay, if you receive money, maybe you're going to be, 0.5 sadder on this, 5-point Likert scale or whatever. But exactly, if you ask people, do you want the money or not? People are going to say, yeah, I want the money. And so maybe that's something that we should be taking into account when we're thinking about policies.
Yeah, my second point is because you said you ran this with a non-profit that specializes in giving out cash transfers.
Yeah.
I just wondering what their reaction to your results were.
Surprisingly positive. I was really nervous about this, honestly. But yeah, they were basically, their conclusion was like, okay, we just need to give more money. Okay. Yeah.
I was wondering if you have any data on what the participant had expected about the effects of cash transfers before they received this, because if the media was full of politicians saying that cash transfers will sort your life out, then it's possible that they had really high expectations and then they were disappointed, which resulted in these negative responses in the surveys.
Yeah, so I wish that we had collected data specifically from the recipients. The closest thing we have is from the prediction study, the lay people person population. We have a nice variation in income. And there we can see that the low income groups did have positive expectations of how much the money would help, but they were actually more pessimistic than others, which I think is kind of interesting. Yeah.
I think we have one more question.
Okay.
Maybe the last question is Laura. Who's,
okay.
online.
All right. So let's start here.
My question is about the skill and mechanism. I understand that the skill and mechanism can happen in general health. From my understanding, you construct your physical health from both objective and subjective measures. I don't see why this will affect your physical health. Because I mean, you do feel worse like when you have more financial needs to meet, but it doesn't affect your lifestyle, your nutrition, basically your physical health. It's more like objective reason, but you still have an active result for your physical health of their physical health.
Yeah, so for the most part, we see, and so as maybe you noticed, there's sort of a negative point estimate for most of the objective measures, but it's not statistically different from zero. And actually going back to the attrition question earlier, it can actually partly be explained by that. And so I think my preferred interpretation is that we're seeing nulls on all the objective and slightly negative on the subjective. I agree with you. You should not see cash making you objectively worse off, but to the extent that you're sort of capturing those things using like things like Likert scale items, like how do you feel this week? Or, how do you think your physical health is this week? Then that's when we might sort of see the more negative effects. Yeah. Is there a question online?
Laura was online. Laura, are you still willing to ask the question?
Hi, yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Just to say that the point about, nonprofits and the way they reacted to these results is really important. I've done some qualitative research with nonprofits and charities here in the UK who have had experience of handing out money to people who are in need. And they've made comments along the lines that when you just give people money, it's not enough to overcome the experience of being excluded from society. They've actually said that's why they've gotten into subjective well-being research, because it's not just about the money, it's about the greater picture of well-being and being able to participate in society. So perhaps that goes along to some of the comments that Andrew was making around the letter or questions around, exactly what they're doing with the money. And I'll be really interested to see kind of what your next experiment on social capital has to say. But certainly the context and the implementation and the nonprofit point of view could be important to explore further in the future.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. I agree. And I think that this is actually a really important piece of all poverty research, which is like, yeah, you can sort of look at just people in poverty and when the effects of different policies, but if you don't generally have support for those policies, whether it's from nonprofits or taxpayers or politicians or whatever, like those policies aren't going to go anywhere. And so I really like that point.
We have one more question in the chat, and I guess we're going to make it the last one, if that's fine. George says, great research. I would like to know more about the relation between UCT and work satisfaction. The null effect on employment means that UCT doesn't change the probability to get employed.
Yeah, so we do not see an effect on employment. I think we see a negative effect on work satisfaction. Yeah, we see a negative effect on work satisfaction.
Actual employment.
We see a decrease in the number of hours worked, but not on likelihood of being employed at all. Yeah, and I think there's also prior work, mostly in the 60s and 70s in the US and Canada, demonstrating that there doesn't tend to be a negative effect on employment either. Maybe a small one, but not huge.
Yeah, because the employment effect could drive well-being decrease.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's, people love work and they hate work.
Yeah,
so
they would self-select in non-working and that would make them less happy. But this is not the case in your situation. They don't self-select and working less. Like less hours, but not actually being unemployed.
Yeah. Which, I mean, also, if I got $2,000, I wouldn't quit my job. So, yeah.
Makes sense. Once,
yeah. Okay, thank you all so much. I really appreciate this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah. So it's actually well-being is not measured very much in low-income countries. Yeah, it's primarily the positive effects.